what is the timeline for releasing Sunday? That also, what is the timeline for the ISO? Because you said they're going to be launched around the same time.
Yeah, so we're going to launch them both at the same time. The ISO will run for 5 epochs. So we didn't want the ISO competing with our protocol, right? So we had this balance between a shorter ISO, but then we don't
I
want
hadn't
people
even thought of that.
we don't want people to miss out on the ISO, so we didn't want to run it for like 1 or 2 epochs. And so we kind of chose a middle ground of 5 epochs. It's a little over a month. So even if you miss like the first epoch, you should still have plenty of time to get involved. In terms of the timeline for launching, and every time I talk about this, I add like the biggest of disclaimers. Things in software can change, and at this point, we've built a large part of the core of the product, and the limiting factors are things that are outside of our control. Things like getting an audit that has been particularly difficult to line up given the kind of fierce competition for good auditors. So things may change. I'm not making a hard commitment, and I beg our community to have some understanding if things do slip. But our current projections place us launching around mid-October.
Okay. And, saying that, you mentioned things that are outside of your control. From my perspective, I'm trying to build a decentralized application experience, and a lot that I'm trying to build is out of my control. And one of those things is wallets. There aren't any DApp-like connector wallets yet other than Namey, and there's some limitations there. And also, as we mentioned earlier, that kilobyte size block or transaction limit, for the blocks. So do you think that on the release of Alonzo, let's say you weren't limited by the audit, would you actually be able to build SundaeSwap if you had everything done, and actually have it run on the release of Alonzo, or is that tooling not there yet because of the limitation, because of the transaction size?
Yeah. So in principle, I think we could launch at the release. The big problem, and the reason we wouldn't, even if the audit wasn't a factor, is exactly because of that tooling, right? We want to make sure that we have a diverse set of wallets to integrate with. We want to make sure that we spend some time optimizing our transaction sizes, because the smaller we can get our scripts and the smaller we can get our transaction sizes, the more throughput we can fit into our protocol, right? So we would optimize there, and at the end of the day, we don't want to. The first label isn't worth a terrible UX to us.
Yeah.
So there are things outside of our control. I think a lot of protocols are working very hard. I don't want to badmouth anybody. And I anticipate a lot of smart contract protocols are going to experience similar kind of problems, the ones that we ran into and the ones that we had to solve to run that live demo. And I don't think you're going to see any substantial, dApps on day one of Alonzo. That being said,
I can speak to that too, relative to everyone that I've talked to, them saying SundaeSwap in October isn't a large delay. There are a lot of moving pieces, and a lot of these moving pieces all have to align around the same time for our projects to release, and it's not just them.
Yeah, you might see, like, as of the hard fork, smart contracts are possible, right? You can submit the transactions to the blockchain. So you might see some very simple apps. Like, I could imagine somebody building some kind of like vesting protocol, right? Where, oh yeah, we lock up funds for X weeks and then they get released. But like the more significant apps are going to take some time for the PAB to catch up, for wallets to catch up, to solve kind of some of the protocol issues that aren't being checked and enforced by the PAB today, things like that.
Okay. Well, thank you for that insight. I and my audience really appreciate it, because without being on the inside, everyone's kind of wondering, what functionality will be available on the 12th, and we have no idea really, other than kind of peering on the inside a little bit. So I really appreciate that.
Yeah, and
Why?
then one last note on that.
No worries.
To some extent, I think IOG and the Cardano community should be looking at that as a feature, not a bug, in the sense that the hard fork is incredibly sensitive, and if there were, you know, they've been doing an incredible job of stress testing it and doing kind of security analysis and all that up to the fork. But God forbid there was some kind of scalability problem or some kind of bug. If there was a way for $100 billion to flood through the doors on day one, and then a bug was discovered, that could be, disastrous, catastrophic for the Cardano community. So the fact that there will be a ramp up time, and you'll get to see more and more traffic over time on the network, will be really healthy for our confidence in Cardano itself.
Yeah, I agree with that completely. I often get the question, when Alonzo, when Goguen? And my response has always been, hopefully when it's ready. I don't care if it releases this month or next month or December. Cardano has always been, slow and meticulous. So why, in the last few months of the biggest release, do we have to have it now? I think that this route is a good way to do it, because it also releases, the base to the public, so people can build tooling. So it's not just IOG limited to being essentially the fathers of the protocol, and here's the tooling that we've created. Now when the base is out, there's going to be multiple people working on tooling, and I think that's going to provide a huge advantage to just tools for developers in general. So one of the main questions that I got on Twitter was, when is the audit going to happen? And, what type of audit is SundaeSwap going to be? And also I'm curious on why audits are important.
Yeah, so for those who don't know, an audit is essentially a health inspector, right? They come in with a fresh pair of eyes and an incredible amount of experience in the security and blockchain domain, whatever company you choose, and kind of double check a lot of the assumptions you might be making, right? And look for common and uncommon attacks against a protocol. So they're very pricey items, and there are very few companies right now who can do a really reputable audit for Cardano. So a big part of our effort on the business side has been lining up an auditor that we're really proud of. And we're not ready to announce that partnership right now, but you should keep an eye out for that. And so the reason that SundaeSwap is getting an audit, and the reason it's so important to us, is because if you look at other DeFi protocols off of Cardano as to kind of predict how might SundaeSwap go, collectively Uniswap V2 and V3 hold, I think last I checked, it was $6 or $7 billion worth of funds. And so they're incredibly lucrative targets for hackers and for people looking to exploit and exfiltrate funds. So it's really important to us to do everything in our power to drive up confidence in that protocol, both, honestly, so that I can sleep at night, but also for our users, right? So people feel confident leaving their funds in our smart contracts. And so we are not sparing a penny, basically, on our audit. It's going to be a very hefty chunk of change, but it's well worth it in our mind. And what they're going to do is, first, they're going to formally kind of write down in mathematics what are all the moving pieces of the SundaeSwap protocol, right? On the surface, it seems very simple. You're swapping one asset for another. But under the hood, there's actually an incredible amount of nuance and detail in exactly how we execute that. So they're going to be writing down that formal protocol, ignoring the code and the Plutus side, and building formal proofs in a proof assistant about what the protocol is, and they'll be delivering a report on that. Once we have that, and once they've kind of provided recommendations on things we should change about the protocol to make it more secure, we'll then kind of we're implementing it in parallel, but we'll maybe migrate those recommendations into our code base, and then they'll do a second round where they do a code review, and they'll look at all of our code, our Haskell code, and say, does this actually faithfully implement that specification. And so, this is going to take a lot of time, and it's one of our, if not the biggest bottleneck in us launching. But it's super important to us. And I've always said from day one that if I don't feel 100% confident in the protocol, we're not going to launch. And the first to launch label is much less important to us than being the than not being first to get hacked.
Yeah, it's a pretty bad label, first to be hacked. Because someone will achieve that label on the Cardano ecosystem.
Somebody will, right? Like Plutus is not a silver bullet, right? It prevents a lot of mistakes that you can make, but it's also such a new paradigm that it creates a lot of opportunities for you to carry assumptions over from a previous blockchain and assume that something is going to work in one way, and then end up, not just getting the funds hacked, but there's also the chance that protocols could deadlock and just like basically burn everybody's funds and not be able to release them back to people. So it's, incredibly sensitive for us to get this right.
Well, thank you for that. I think that's going to answer a lot of people's questions about the audit, and also, the importance of it, because I didn't understand the phase approach. And do you feel that Plutus, it's not a silver bullet, but the actual auditing method, can yield better results because it's a formally verified language?
Yeah, I think so. I think that having more concrete semantics around how it operates, right? A formal specification for this that you can feed into something like Agda or Lean, which are kind of theorem provers that like heavyweight mathematicians use, gives a lot of kind of potential growth for these kind of static analysis tools and proofs that can be made about protocols. Whereas with something on Solidity, there's some amount of formal verification you can do, but it also boils down to just thinking really hard, which can still be very fallible.
Yeah. Well, thank you for that.